The disdain and the collision. He'd thrown her out, telling her she was worthless. But 4 years later, in a grocery store, the billionaire CEO saw her with twins who looked exactly like him. Daniel Sterling had built his reputation on being decisive, ruthless, and utterly self-assured. He was the kind of man who closed multi-million-dollar deals with the same indifference he used to order his morning coffee. Yet, that night, standing in his penthouse with the city lights sprawling behind him, he let words slip that would echo far longer than he anticipated. He looked at Valerie, the young woman who had once brought warmth to the sterile world he'd so carefully constructed, and with a coldness that briefly startled even him, he told her she was worthless and shut her out of his life. The sound of the door closing behind her was supposed to signify control, a final ending orchestrated by him. But instead, it left a void he couldn't name, a silence that pressed in from the walls and followed him into sleep like a shadow. Valerie stumbled into the night air, clutching her purse as if it could shield her from the weight of what had just happened, her cheeks wet with tears that blurred the world into streaks of light and color. It wasn't just the cruelty of his words that tore at her, it was their finality, the brutal certainty of a man who had already decided her future wasn't worth sharing his own. She wanted to scream, to tell him the truth she'd been carrying inside, but her voice was trapped behind a wall of pride and pain. She couldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing how deeply he had wounded her. With every step she took away from his glass and steel tower, she felt something within her harden, a fragile resolve forming where her dreams of a shared life had once been. Daniel returned to his desk that night, pouring a glass of whiskey and pulling up files on an impending acquisition, pretending the encounter was just another severed tie, nothing more than a necessary cut to streamline his life. But even as he read contracts, the image of her face when he spoke those words popped up uninvited, and for a split second, he questioned himself. He shoved the thought away, convincing himself that sentimentality was weakness, that love had no place in the life of a man like him. He had long convinced himself that emotions were a distraction from greatness, that sacrifices had to be made to rise above the rest, and if Valerie was one of those sacrifices, it only proved he was strong enough to carry it out. Still, late into the night, when the city was quiet, and even the glow of success felt hollow, he found himself listening for a sound that never came, a presence that was no longer there, and the emptiness he dismissed as fatigue gnawed at the edges of his composure. Meanwhile, Valerie found herself in a tiny rented room across town, her hands shaking as she sank onto the thin mattress, pressing her palm against her stomach in a gesture that was half instinct, half prayer. She whispered into the darkness, words no one but the child inside her would ever hear, promises of protection and love. Even if the father had turned his back, she felt the magnitude of her situation pressing down on her, the knowledge that she had no safety net, no wealthy man by her side, no powerful name to shield her from the coming hardship. But instead of crushing her, it ignited a fire she didn't know she possessed. Tears still streamed down her cheeks, but they no longer carried only pain. They carried determination, a vow that no matter how little he thought she was worth, she would prove to herself, and the tiny heartbeat within her, that she was more than enough. Years of separate lives. Valerie's life shifted quickly after that night, and the weeks that followed felt like walking into a storm without an umbrella. Each day whipping her with new uncertainties and fears. But with every blow, she discovered a resilience she'd never needed before. She found work as an assistant at a small publishing house, a job that barely covered rent and food, but she clung to it because it was steady, something she could rely on, while the rest of her world was listing. The mornings were filled with exhaustion, the kind that seeped into her bones. But she pushed through with quiet resolve, her hand often resting protectively over her growing belly as she sorted manuscripts or answered the constant ringing of phones. No one in the office knew her story. No one saw the weight she carried, and that anonymity became her strange comfort, as if she could rebuild her identity in silence, brick by brick, without anyone's pity. Daniel buried himself in work even more than usual, chasing bigger deals and pouring all his energy into expanding his empire, as if he could fill the void within him with numbers and contracts. To the outside world, he seemed untouchable, the very picture of success, with articles praising his brilliance and magazines calling him one of the country's most eligible bachelors. But behind the closed doors of his penthouse, he felt a corrosive restlessness he couldn't shake. He'd pour another whiskey, looking out at the same skyline Valerie looked at, but instead of hope, he felt emptiness, the feeling of having traded something invaluable for the illusion of control. Valerie's pregnancy wasn't easy. She had no partner to lean on, no steadying hand when the world felt overwhelming. But she learned to find strength in the smallest moments. When she first heard the heartbeat of her twins at a checkup, tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming love. And it was in that instant she knew she could endure anything. She told herself again and again that they would never feel worthless, because to her, they were everything. The birth and the secret. When the twins were born, Valerie felt at once the most fragile and the most powerful she had ever been in her life. The little boys had matching tufts of dark hair, tiny hands that curled around her fingers, and the same piercing blue eyes that instantly reminded her of Daniel, though she quickly pushed the thought away. She whispered their names softly, Luke and Dylan, chosen after months of quiet deliberation, names that sounded strong and full of promise. The early years were brutal in ways Valerie hadn't anticipated. Nights blurred into days as she grappled with feedings, diapers, and the relentless exhaustion of caring for two babies with no one to share the burden. Yet even in the moments she thought she might collapse, a spark of determination kept her moving. She uncovered a resilience in herself that astounded her, a strength that grew from the very children she was raising. As the twins grew into curious, vivacious toddlers, Valerie began to notice just how much they resembled Daniel. Their striking blue eyes and expressions mirrored pieces of a man she had tried so hard to forget. Strangers often commented on how handsome they were, asking if their father was around, and each time Valerie would smile politely and redirect the conversation, though her chest tightened inside. The collision. By the time the twins turned 4, Valerie had carved out a rhythm that balanced work, motherhood, and the constant juggling act of survival. The boys had grown into bright, curious little sparks, inseparable and full of mischief, with the same blue eyes that sometimes ached Valerie because of who they resembled. The collision of their worlds came one unassuming Saturday afternoon when Valerie took the twins to the local supermarket near her apartment. She was focused on the shelves, comparing prices and trying to make the right choice, when a voice behind her froze her in place. Daniel had stepped into the same grocery store, a rare decision for him. As he rounded the corner and saw Valerie standing there, her hair slightly messy from the day, her expression tired but radiant in its quiet strength, and beside her, 2 small boys with dark hair and unmistakable blue eyes. The floor seemed to shift beneath him. He was paralyzed, unable to move, his heart hammering in a way it hadn't in years. Valerie turned slowly, feeling the weight of someone's gaze, and as her eyes met Daniel's, a surge of emotion hit her so powerfully she had to grip the shopping cart to keep steady. She saw the recognition flash in his eyes as he looked at the twins, and panic surged in her. The twins, oblivious to the emotional storm crackling between the adults, held on to her hands and looked curiously at the stranger who was staring at them, as if they were the most important discovery of his life. Daniel's mind raced as he took in the sight of the children, their features a mirror of his own, their eyes so unmistakably linked to him that denial was impossible. He realized in that instant what he had lost, what he had thrown away with his cruel words and arrogant disdain. For the first time in years, his carefully constructed world fractured, replaced by a shock so profound it left him speechless. Valerie finally found her voice, though it shook as she forced herself to speak. She told the boys it was time to go and began pushing the cart. But his voice followed her down the aisle, calling her name in a tone so raw and desperate that it froze her steps. He asked if they were his, though his voice betrayed that he already knew the answer. Valerie's expression hardened. She reminded him of the night he had told her she was worthless, the night he had thrown her out without a second thought, and told him she had raised the boys alone without needing his name or his fortune. Her voice was steady now, sharpened by years of struggle and survival, and though it trembled with emotion, it carried a strength that made Daniel flinch. For the first time in his life, Daniel Sterling felt powerless. He tried to explain, stumbling over words about being young and making mistakes, but Valerie cut him off with a simple, devastating truth. He had made a choice, and that choice had cost him 4 years of his sons' lives. The difficult redemption. Daniel began showing up in places Valerie least expected, not in the intrusive way of a man trying to impose his will, but with a quiet persistence that unnerved and disarmed her in equal measure. He showed up at the park one Saturday morning, sitting at a distance on a bench with a book in his hands, pretending to read, while his eyes inevitably drifted toward the twins chasing each other across the grass. For a man who had spent his life conquering boardrooms, the patience he displayed now was something new, a humility born of desperation and guilt. Luke and Dylan, in their natural innocence, responded faster than Valerie. One of them wandered up to his bench and asked if he had any snacks. Daniel froze, his heart racing, and produced a wrapped granola bar he'd bought earlier, handing it over with shaky hands. Valerie saw it and hurried over, her face flushed with panic, shooting him a warning look. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the gentleness in his eyes when he looked at the little boy. The breakthrough came unexpectedly one rainy afternoon, as Valerie struggled with grocery bags and 2 restless children outside her apartment building. Daniel suddenly appeared with an umbrella, wordlessly taking some of the bags from her hands. The exhaustion in Valerie's body overcame her resistance, and for once, she allowed him to walk beside her. The pivotal moment arrived one night at the hospital. One of the twins spiked a high fever and weakened so fast that Valerie panicked. Daniel appeared out of nowhere, drove them all to the hospital, and refused to leave their side during the long night in the emergency room. He fetched water, talked to the doctors, held Valerie's hand when her strength flagged, and even carried the healthy twin until he fell asleep. When the crisis passed, Valerie felt her defenses crumble. She saw Daniel then, not as the man who had abandoned her, but as the man desperately trying to be a father fighting for his children with everything he had. He wasn't faking it. He was living the truth of his own remorse and love. The miracle of forgiveness. The days after the hospital visit marked the beginning of something new. Valerie didn't instantly forgive him, but she allowed him to stay. She permitted him to share dinners, put the twins to bed, and stand by her side at school meetings. Daniel proved his commitment not with grand gestures of wealth or power, but with the quiet, everyday acts of presence. One evening, as the 4 of them walked down a city street together, Valerie felt one of the twins slip his small hand into hers and the other into Daniel's. She looked over at Daniel, who was watching her with a soft, vulnerable expression, as if waiting for her to decide if he truly belonged there. Valerie didn't speak, but she didn't pull away either. And in that silence, something profound passed between them. By the time spring arrived, their lives had settled into a rhythm that felt both new and long-awaited. Daniel had fully assumed his role as a father. The man who had once told her she was nothing had become the man who now valued her and his children above all else. And in that realization lay the quiet miracle of forgiveness. It was not a story of perfection, but of rebuilding something broken into something stronger. Valerie knew they would always carry scars, but she also knew those scars no longer defined them. What defined them now was the love that had survived despite everything, the family that had grown from pain into joy, and the future they were finally ready to face together. The anchor of consistency. 1 year later, the garden wedding faded into time, but the promise made under the setting sun held true. A year after their intimate ceremony, Daniel and Valerie's life had settled into a rhythm that was no longer about survival, but about quiet prosperity. They had traded the adrenaline of struggle for the constancy of love. Daniel was no longer purely a CEO. He had sold most of his corporate assets, keeping only a modest, stable portfolio, and had channeled his strategic mind into building their home. His talent for logistics now applied to organizing pediatrician appointments, planning family vacations, and ensuring the furnace in their small mountain apartment ran perfectly, without fail. Valerie, for her part, had left her assistant job. Daniel had encouraged her to pursue her art studies again. She now taught part-time art classes at the community center and sold paintings that, for the first time in her life, were full of color and light, not the darkness that had once consumed her. The last shadow of distrust. Despite the peace, one emotional scar remained: Valerie's lingering distrust. It manifested not in jealousy, but in a fear of absence. When Daniel had to take short trips back to the city, usually for meetings with his lawyers, regarding the final dissolution of his old firms, Valerie would become quiet and tense. One evening, Daniel returned from a day trip to Chicago. He found Valerie in the kitchen, her coffee cooling in the thermos she usually took to the park. "You look tired," Daniel said, moving to embrace her. She pulled away slightly, not with hostility, just with an exhausted caution. "Were you late?" "Highway traffic, honey. I'm sorry." He understood. It wasn't about the traffic. It was about whether the old Daniel had gotten stuck back in that world of glass and steel. "I had a bad dream," Valerie confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I dreamt you stayed, that you saw the penthouse, and remembered how easy it was to live without us." Daniels took her by the shoulders, forcing her to meet his gaze. "That life wasn't easy. It was empty. I have never felt more alive than I do now, cleaning crayon off the rug." He paused. "The only reason I keep going to the city is to make sure my past can't touch our present. I promise you that life is over." The final act of detachment. The next day, Daniel did the unthinkable. He called his attorney and finalized the sale of his Chicago penthouse. In its place, he purchased and began renovating a small, run-down building in the center of their mountain town. The first floor would become a simple wood workshop and office space. The second, a bright art studio for Valerie. A week later, he took Valerie and the twins to see the property. "This is where I'm going to work now," Daniel said, handing a set of keys to Valerie. "And the city?" Valerie asked, her blue eyes glistening with disbelief. "The city is no longer my headquarters. This is my headquarters." Daniel smiled, and his smile was no longer arrogant, but vulnerable and happy. "The workshop is for me. The studio is for you. So you never have to teach art in a corner again." Valerie looked at the space, smelling the new wood and fresh paint. It was the tangible proof that Daniel had not just changed his priorities, he had physically relocated his ambition. There was no longer a quick path back to the corporate world. He had burned the bridge completely. "Daniel," She hugged him with renewed force, an embrace that was not one of forgiveness, but of total acceptance. "The only certainty I need in life is your presence and the boys," Daniel whispered into her ear. The full story for the boys. With stability and trust restored, Daniel and Valerie knew it was time for the complete truth for the boys. They had introduced Daniel as a longtime friend who was now their forever family, but they needed to speak the real names, father and son. One night, while the twins, Luke and Dylan, were snuggled between them on the couch reading a picture book, Daniel took Luke's hand. "Boys, we have something really important to tell you." Valerie took Dylan's hand. They told the boys the story, not as a betrayal, but as a tragic misunderstanding fueled by fear and pride. They explained that Daniel had made a huge mistake, that he had been a coward to run, but that the reason he came back was because the love he felt for them and for Valerie was stronger than any mistake. The boys listened quietly, their little blue eyes fixed on them. Finally, Luke asked, "Daddy, do you promise that even if it gets hard, you'll never leave again?" Daniel nodded, tears stinging his eyes. "I promise, Luke. My word is my anchor, and you are my home." Valerie saw the final liberation in that moment. Daniel was no longer fighting for her forgiveness. He was fighting for his son's faith. And that was the most honest and noble fight of all. The man who had once called her nothing had returned to become the everything of their small world. Building bridges, an architect in the town. The move into his workshop office, which Daniel named the Anchor, was a quiet but significant event. The first challenge for Daniel was winning over the townspeople, especially those who viewed him as the rich city guy who suddenly bought up property. The most critical test came from Javier, a respected local craftsman, and the father who helped Daniel build a sandcastle in the park from a previous unseen encounter. Javier, like many, was wary of the former CEO's intentions. The encounter at the Anchor. One morning, Javier approached the Anchor workshop. He watched Daniel, sweating as he sanded large wooden beams for what would become Valerie's art studio. "Mr. Sterling," Javier said, his tone formal and reserved. "Heard you're renovating this place." "Please call me Daniel," Daniel corrected, offering a hand smudged with sawdust. "And yes, I'm building a studio for my wife. Name's Javier. I came to warn you. There's a lot of respect in this town for folks who build, not for folks who buy and leave." Daniel nodded, understanding the subtext perfectly. "I appreciate your concern, Javier, but I'm not going anywhere. This is my only address now. In fact, I need a great local carpenter for the workshop's furniture. Would you be interested?" Javier hesitated, surprised by the direct job offer. "I build my own furniture." "I know, and that's why I want your help. I want my wife and boys to see that quality isn't bought. It's worked for, right here in town. I'll pay the fair local price." The gesture, which valued Javier's craftsmanship over Daniel's money, dissolved the initial barrier. Javier accepted, and the collaboration became Daniel's first genuine bridge into the community. Valerie's battle against prejudice. While Daniel built local ties, Valerie faced prejudice at the Community Arts Center. Many of her colleagues, upon learning she was the wife of the new property investor, assumed she was only there as a hobbyist. At one faculty meeting, the director commented condescendingly, "It's wonderful, Valerie, that you can now dedicate yourself to your passions without worrying about the paycheck." Valerie nodded with a smile that concealed a core of steel. "Director, the only reason I never stopped working is because I never relied on a paycheck that wasn't mine. If my marriage's stability depended on my job, believe me, I'd be the most stable person in this room." The comment cut the air. Valerie had used her past experience and her new independence to reaffirm her worth in a way the community couldn't ignore. She wasn't there to play. She was there to work. The ultimate commitment. The true test of Daniel's commitment to the town arrived 6 months later. His former city lawyer presented him with an incredibly lucrative offer, a 1-year remote consulting contract with a non-compete clause, meaning an astronomical salary in exchange for not working with any other firm during that time. Daniel was tempted, not by the money, but by the professional validation. But the contract required him to sign an exclusivity clause, prohibiting any side projects, including the renovation of the Anchor and the development of the art studio. Daniel sat at the kitchen table with Valerie after putting the boys to bed. "Here it is," he said, sliding the contract across the table. "We could pay off your mother's mortgage, secure the boys' college funds, and triple your studio's endowments." Valerie didn't look at the money clause. Her eyes zeroed in on the exclusivity clause. "This means you couldn't work with Javier," Valerie stated. "And you'd have to abandon the renovation of the workshop, right?" "Yes, but it's just for a year." Valerie gently closed the contract. "2 years ago, I asked you to choose consistency over ambition. This contract offers you wealth in exchange for your identity and your integration into this community. Daniel, we don't need a fortune. We need our home to be unbreakable." Daniel looked at the contract, then at Valerie, who reflected the strength of their new life. The next day, he rejected the offer. Instead, he called Javier. Together, they founded a small design and construction firm, specializing in ethical, historical renovations in the town. The commitment was complete. Daniel had chosen to build a legacy of presence, not of wealth. And that choice was the final proof that sealed Valerie's happiness and peace. The threefold bond, the grandparents' blessing, Daniel's refusal of the lucrative contract was the final test for Valerie. For the town, it was the start of a legend. People began to see Daniel not as the exiled mogul, but as a man of his word, an ethical builder. The firm, the Anchor, Daniel and Javier's carpentry business, thrived, specializing in restorations that honored the history of the mountain community. The one remaining emotional hurdle was integrating the full truth into the heart of the boys. The quiet conversation. At 6 years old, Luke and Dylan had fully accepted Daniel into their lives, but they still occasionally called him Daniel, or sometimes Mom's friend. Both parents agreed it was time to name the past. One afternoon, while the three of them were painting walls in Valerie's art studio, a joyful chaos of laughter and color, Valerie knelt down beside Luke. "Sweetheart," Valerie began, "remember how we talked about some families having long, complicated stories?" Luke nodded, his face smeared with green paint. "Your dad, Daniel is your dad. He hasn't just been Mom's friend. He's been your father all along." Luke dropped his paintbrush. He looked at Valerie, then at Daniel. His small blue eyes filled with that reflective caution Valerie knew well. "But where were you before?" Dylan asked. Daniel immediately knelt down, taking both boys' hands. He offered no lie, no complicated explanation. "I was a fool, boys. I was a coward." Daniel's voice was steady. "I missed years of your life because I made a huge mistake and let fear and pride pull me away from your mom and from you. But that's over. I chose to come back. I choose to stay." Luke took a moment to process it. He looked at Daniel's paintbrush, then at his eyes. "Are you going to read us a story tonight?" he asked. "Every night, if you'll let me," Daniel promised. Luke smiled. A child's forgiveness is simple and direct. It is earned with presence and promise. The boy stood up, gave Daniel a quick hug, and went back to his painting. The grandparents' blessing. Valerie's mother, who had helped her flee years ago, had been the silent guardian of her daughter's truth and dignity. Though she saw Daniel's transformation, she kept her distance, withholding her complete blessing. Daniel knew that to close this chapter completely, he needed to face the woman who had been Valerie's rock during her darkest years. One afternoon, Daniel went to Valerie's mother's house, bringing a bouquet of flowers and some local herbal tea. "Mom, I know I've never been your favorite person," Daniel started, his tone one of genuine humility. "You're not, Daniel. Her mother's voice was dry. "You hurt us deeply. You left us alone." "You're right. And I'm not here to ask for your forgiveness, but to thank you." Daniel met her gaze. "Thank you for giving Valerie and the boys a safe place when I didn't have the courage to. Thank you for being the mother and father I wasn't." Valerie's mother looked at the flowers. The silence stretched. "Valerie fought hard. She built a strong life." The grandmother finally turned, her eyes piercing. "Don't break her peace again, Daniel. She doesn't need you anymore, but the boys do." "I won't fail them again," Daniel promised. Valerie's mother sighed, her face finally softening. "Then come inside and have some tea, and help your wife finish hanging that big, silly canvas she's painting for the new church." Daniel felt an immense sense of release. It hadn't been an absolution, but a transfer of trust. The grandmother had blessed his permanence. The family was finally whole, bound not just by blood, but by the fierce commitment of their new life. The philosophy of sanctuary, a shared legacy. Daniel and Valerie's life with Luke and Dylan had stabilized, but their story didn't end in comfort. It evolved into a mission. They had both learned that pride and unchecked ambition were the true villains. Daniel, with the help of Javier the carpenter, completed the renovation of the Anchor. The space became a community hub. Downstairs housed the carpentry and Daniel's small construction office. Upstairs, Valerie's art studio transformed into something more than just a workshop. Art as a refuge. Valerie used her art to heal not just her own wounds, but others as well. Her studio became the home of the First Stone Foundation, a discreet non-profit program funded by the assets Daniel had ethically preserved. The foundation's goal was simple: to help women who, like her, found themselves in emotional exile after a betrayal, a financial collapse, or a sudden loss of support. Valerie offered therapeutic art workshops. She taught these women that art was not a hobby or a weakness, as Daniel once cruelly implied, but a tool of resistance. She taught them to paint not what they saw, but what they felt. "Betrayal will try to leave you empty," Valerie would tell them. "But you use that emptiness as your largest canvas. Build your own worth. Don't allow anyone else to set the price." The new construction project. While Valerie rebuilt souls, Daniel rebuilt spaces. His company, the Anchor, won a bid to renovate a sprawling, abandoned convent. But instead of turning it into a luxury condo complex, Daniel proposed transforming it into a temporary residence for single mothers going through difficult transitions. Many of them, the same women from Valerie's workshops. It was a project that merged his business vision, using corporate expertise to secure large resources, with his new life ethic, building sanctuaries, not empires. When presenting the project, Daniel named it the Sanctuary of Coherence. "In the past, I built towers that reflected my arrogance," Daniel explained to the town board. "Now, I want to build foundations that reflect dignity and independence. The worth of a building is not in its height, but in the strength of the lives it holds." The couple's legacy. The project became their greatest joint achievement. Daniel handled the structure, the financing, and the logistics. Valerie designed the interiors, light-filled, functional spaces, with a central art studio for the workshops. Valerie's mother, the former guardian, was now a constant figure on the site, overseeing the woodworking furniture made by Javier and ensuring every detail was perfect. She didn't supervise the finances, but the ethics. One evening, as Daniel reviewed blueprints at home, Valerie walked in. "The original plan was for you to be a shark and me a victim, and for you to ruin us," Valerie said, with a playful smile. "That plan failed," Daniel replied, looking up. "Fate had other blueprints, to turn us into the strongest, most consistent version of ourselves." Valerie sat beside him, taking his hand. "In the past, our love was a beautiful jewel, but it was fragile. Now," Daniel said, tightening his grip on her hand. Our love is the steel that holds the sanctuary. It's stronger because we built it from the ashes. Daniel, Valerie, Luke, and Dylan's life became a testament that true wealth is measured by invested time and the active choice of ethics over ego. They didn't just reclaim their home, they built a new one, larger and with open doors, proving that the greatest revenge is not ruin, but resilience and active forgiveness.